Welcome, everybody. My second edition of a talk at Wellesley Academy since I got back. And we try and use these cafes for a bit of social construction of knowledge. There are cafe conversations. They're not so much monologues. And they follow a structure. We'll get you all to meet each other, give you a bit of a provocation. And then I'll run through what I'm thinking about, put you back into discussion, and then we'll debrief that. So that's the flow of these sessions. There is a chat box, as you know, and you're invited to use it. And I need to give a shout out to the University of Cape Town's 8-week instructional design program. I finished the last module last night, Tuesday night. And that's given me a great opportunity to brush up on my understanding of instructional design. So what little I know about instructional design is in its current form is with thanks to the University of Cape Town. And where I'm off base, I'm hoping that you guys will fill in the gaps. So to get us started, I'd like you all to head off into a breakaway, which Liesl will set up, and just meet each other. There's some fantastic people on this call today, so I'm hoping that you get a bit of value out of that. We'll leave you in there for about 12.5 minutes, and we'd like you to talk about two things: what brought you here today, and what connects OD and instructional design in your organization or in your work. So, a good answer would be to just share why you came and a little bit about who you are, particularly if you haven't met each other. We do want you to deepen your network. And then to think about, what do you know about instructional design on the one side, or what do you know about OD on the other side? We have a guest staying with us from Cape Town, and she read one of my recent posts on LinkedIn, and she said, Craig, I've got one criticism. You talk about OD throughout your posts, and I've got no idea what that is. So we'll explore that a little. What connects OD and instructional design in your organization? Go and meet some interesting people. We'll see you back in about 12 minutes. I hope you met some nice people. I did. And we're not going to debrief it now because we're going to put you back in round 2. You're going to stick with the same groups, Liesl, in round 2. Okay, so you get to work with those people again after a bit of chat from me. Should we go ahead and get that started? You're seeing my screen, but it's not in presentation mode. And now it's in presentation mode. Yep.
Yep.
Okay, so in homage to my friend Heidi, who said, what are we talking about when we talk about OD? And maybe for the OD practitioners, what are we talking about when we talk about instructional design? I've used Wikipedia definitions, and for the purists on both sides of the fence, there's reason for that. Obviously, Worldview has its own definition of OD. Other practitioners will have their own definitions of instructional design. I wanted to find some neutral ground, and I thought Wikipedia was neutral enough and indicative enough of the two sides of the fence. I don't particularly like either definition as a confession, but looking at OD, what are we talking about here? And I think we can all agree that we are talking about organizational change, some form or another. The goal of which is to modify a group or an organization's performance and or culture. I think that's general enough. I think there might be a few other focus areas. It talks about the fact that OD emerged from human relations studies in the 30s. And for the OD people who enjoy OD's history, a lot of OD emerged from training departments. I don't know how many people knew that, but the T group work that I think spun out eventually into large-scale change work comes from training divisions, where they were really wrestling with the effect of the wars, the changing workforce, the shifting technology, the state and context, state of the people and the context of the work. So OD on the one side, very much about groups and organizations. On the other side, instructional design. So systematically working with the acquisition of knowledge, creating interventions to assist in the transition. It's the essence, I think, of instructional design, this intentional support. Talk about consistent, reliable, efficient, effective, appealing, engaging, inspiring acquisition of knowledge. We were chatting in our small group breakaway about this, the importance of working with motivation on the instructional design side to make it this appealing and to increase the chances of success of learning. So if I try and paraphrase that, I get to this idea. In the center for me, and at least the world's view way of work in OD is issue-centric. We don't really believe that you should be doing intervention work for its own sake. So there should be some issue that triggers that usually at the group or organizational level. From an instructional design perspective, instructional design very much focuses on the learning outcome that you're trying to resolve. You know, what is the learning knot or the learning problem or the issue that this instructional design is supposed to deal with? Maybe again, contentiously, learning and development works with learning strategies, and I would argue that organizational development works with power and political strategies. And what I mean by that is so much of the work is to bring voice to and participation and inclusion and social construction of desired futures and change strategies. And I think the line works with pragmatic strategies. This is a way to maybe contrast the three. But what brings them all together is some kind of issue, something that needs to be resolved. Other things that I think learning and OD have in common, at least the modern version, is constructivist. I think there's an acceptance on both sides that change is a social construct, including learning. So there's no learning that is an individual act. Learning is constructed in relation to others. And both of them are interested in behavior. As I understand modern learning and development, it's not knowledge for knowledge's sake, it's knowledge for changes in behavior, to be able to do differently, to be differently. And both learning and OD are interested in that sort of way of change, constructivist, and outcome of change, some sort of behavioral shift. Well, here's the main thoughts then that I wanted to talk about. The first thought is that learning powers transformation. So I'm working with structuration theory, and on the right-hand side in this space where Anthony Giddens asked, what is it that creates social change? And he talked about language and ideas, power and resources, and norms and culture in a relationship with each other. What I think we can agree on is that learning both uses and develops language and ideas. So it seems fairly obvious, but when you're learning something, you learn a new language or a new set of ideas around whatever it is you're learning. And that is a catalyst for organizational change. So I that ticks a box for me in terms of learning powers transformation. Learning draws on and reallocates power and resources. So I know it's fridge magnet wisdom, but knowledge is power. We're comfortable saying that all the time. And clearly, in an organizational context, I think it's true. I think people who are recognized as the more knowledgeable other, which I'm stealing a phrase from Zagotsky's learning theory, but the more knowledgeable you are, effectively, the more power and control you have over your own destiny. Learning draws on and reallocates power and resources, which enables organizational change. We all know as OD practitioners, if we can't get enough power in the room, we're not going to be able to drive change. And then learning shares and reshapes norms and culture. So shares norms and culture. Obviously, we learn norms and we learn culture, but knowledge can also reshape norms and culture, and that defines organizational change, because we're always looking for that new normal, that new outcome. So learning powers transformation. Learning and organizational change are mediated, is the second big idea. They don't happen on their own. They just don't. A person cannot learn something without something else happening in between. Now, that was a difficult idea for me to accept at first, because I pride myself on being a self-learner. But of course, that's just hubris and arrogance, because there, at the very least, would be a book that I read, or a blog, or a conversation, or there might be a teacher, there'll be peers involved, a facilitator, an observation, or an accident. But something comes between myself and the learning. It's always mediated. So learning powers transformation, learning and organizational change are mediated. Something helps. We, all the practitioners on this call, are intentional mediators. So we put our hands up to say, we'll play a part in this. I would say OD practitioners work at the group, organization, and societal level. Coaches with individuals and teams as the units of transformation. Teachers work with individuals. In my understanding, I haven't had a teacher take me on about this, but I assume that the objective of the teacher is the individual transformation. And then we have this interesting, not arrival. I think technology has always been a learning mediator. The moment you pick up a tool, you learn something different, a new tool, a new way of work. But AI is such a strange tool, and we're not quite sure what mediation role it's going to end up playing. We can say it's going to be quite significant and quite general. So probably more general, say, than a tractor, as a way of learning, new ways of preparing a field. I think AI might be a more general mediator in learning and change. So if learning powers transformation, if learning and organizational change are mediated, and we are intentional mediators, we need to share an understanding of the common issue or the common dissonance. We all agree, as far as I can tell, the transformation starts with a trigger moment, a vision, some dissatisfaction with the current state, wonder, curiosity, but some sense that this dissonance where I need to move, or we need to move. But to accelerate transformation, we should accelerate the learning then about how is it that we can move, and what are our options, and what might that future look like. We also, I think, can agree, because you've seen it, I hope, or we've experienced great instructional design. Great instructional design keeps you motivated. And for those on the call who've worked with change inside organizations, getting people on the bus or getting buy-in, or those horrible, often too late interventions, because those people should have been maybe on the bus before it left the station. But however you think about it, great instructional design keeps you engaged in the process. You don't disengage. You want to stay in a bit longer, and you want to play a bit more, which will enable and enrich the transformation work. So finally, I think, I worry, I wonder, and I don't know, the theory of learning and the theory of organizational change that you're using should have some relationship with one another. They should be aligned in some way. So I'm not talking about generally. I think that's too much to ask. But inside an organization, when there should be some relationship between those that are working with the learning and those that are working with OD or change or whatever else. And I'm hoping when you get into your breakouts, you can think about how might that alignment work or not work. So that is the main thoughts that I wanted to share to provoke your round 2. And when you come back from round 2, we're going to not have any more slides. We want to hear what you've discussed. So in the breakaways, what are your thoughts? I mean, we don't want to be too prescriptive about what you talk about, but we're very interested in examples of good or bad use of instructional design in OD initiatives from wherever you are, and whatever that experience might look like. What is working? What is not working? I'll give you a bit longer in this breakout, Gisela. I think we said 20 minutes, was it?
Yes, we said 20 minutes.
We really encourage you to please dig deep and start to unpack those cases of what isn't working in your world. And we'll see you in 20 minutes.
Yes, so room 1, Andre, Eugene, Kirsten, and Linda, they were back first, and I asked if it was enough time, and they said yes, but it was a robust conversation. So let's hear some feedback from you guys. What did you chat about? What stood out for you? What would you like to share with the group? Kirsten.
I'm happy to share. I suppose I shared one of the things that I've tried, and with some difficulty, is the concept of a retrospective as a learning experience after a cycle or sprint of development or project, from the agile sort of way of running things. And I've been trying to bring in this time to reflect and learn as a group on what's happened. And one of the things that I mentioned that I struggle with is, there's a current cultural way of doing things, which is a hustle, bustle, move fast, not stop, and trying to slow everybody down and reflect and learn is quite a challenge. Especially, I think the younger engineers are very open to that and happy to learn and there and willing, but sometimes I'm struggling with the more senior people who, and I loved what Craig said earlier about, power, and knowledge is power and learning is the transfer. And but for them, they see that time as kind of unnecessary for them, or like they're not going to learn anything out of that. And even if they are there, it's for the benefit of everyone else, but kind of low on the priority list because other things take preference. And that's a challenge. And we talked about that a bit.
Right. Thank you, Kirsten. Definitely is. I think the busyness so typically and often gets in our way. Anybody else in that room that'd like to share anything? Contribute? Eugene doesn't have much of a voice. No, you guys good? All right, then room 2, and there's only Karen and Craig left. The other 2 delegates of that room is left. Who's going to give us some feedback? Craig, you probably feel like it shouldn't be you.
I'll make an attempt. Sure, I always battle to try and pick out the most succinct points of these conversations. I think that some of the, I guess the gist of the conversation is around L&D not operating in isolation. And we got to speak about kind of big change projects, and when it works well, kind of you're partnering with L&D almost from the beginning, and they're part of the process, and they're understanding kind of, it's not just about taking something and making training out of it. It's understanding the context. When it's not working well is when that relationship sort of is not there. And Rochelle also said something that kind of really resonated with me around kind of trying to apply something but not being fully aware of how that's going to land specifically in a South African market. And we ran out of time, but I actually had a similar experience with her where during COVID, we kind of went, right, let's move on to, online learning. And her experience was that it didn't actually work as well as it could have. And there were multiple factors coming into play, people's, technical ability, their motivation, etc., etc. And I had a very similar experience in the organization I was working at the time, that we actually spent a lot of money on sort of curating and providing this online content, and it fell completely flat. So again, I think coming back to that duality of learning and development, bringing something, but making sure that the context around which you're doing it is still there, that you're not sort of doing this in isolation and not being aware of what is actually happening on the ground. And how do you keep testing that actually this is being effective? And if it's not being effective, why? I think that about sums it out. Craig can add if I've missed anything.
No, I don't think you missed anything. I think you captured nicely, because we were very lucky. We got this contrast of good cases and let's say less good cases. And the good cases were what I think from an OD perspective we think of as good change, where a lot of the stakeholders included L&D and included instructional design right up front. Leadership was involved, the messaging was clear, and the instructional design teams are able to work with the communication strategies and use their expertise to motivate and draw in and communicate and inform. The bad examples were usually around speed. So the speed with which people had to respond to COVID in an organization where you've got 60,000 people in the field and a relatively high degree of churn, you're doing a lot of face-to-face training in the field, and you can't go to the field anymore. And the impact of trying to make the switch to asynchronous learning from synchronous face-to-face failed, and the bill was 3 years of performance failure that they're now trying to recover without going back to synchronous face-to-face field instruction. So they're now they're developing blended learning approaches. And the thing that struck me there was, in order to do that, she kept referring to South African context. She said, our Indian colleagues, even though they have the same kind of rural population, that rural population is tech savvy. Whereas in our South African context, that rural population is not tech savvy, may have a matric certificate. And so they're investing heavily in in bringing not only the vocational training skills, but also future fit. This is word you kept coming back to, future fit, tech savvy to the workforce. That is massive for South Africa, if you think about it, because it's filling a hole that maybe the education system isn't filling, and that's bringing that technology to a wider and wider and wider base. I wonder how many companies are doing that in South Africa. That it's all very well to talk about the shift to blended learning, but that involves tech, and you've got to have a tech savvy workforce. So we've got great stories. She also talked a lot about, or some about, evaluation. So I think the L&D people and instructional design people get evaluation. They bake it in, the good ones, bake it into the program. I'm not sure that the OD and change work always bakes it in. So I think the evaluation discipline on the L&D side has got something to teach, at least me. I was paying a lot of attention there. Thanks, Liesel.
Cool. Thank you, Craig. Okay, let's get some feedback from room 3. We had Barbara, Gugu, Levine, and Mbali.
Thank you. So we had quite an insightful discussion as well, just looking at what doesn't work or where are the problem areas, especially with the alignment of instructional design and the OD perspective. And one of the things that we picked up was obviously our role in terms of as OD practitioners is we need to understand our mediation role or the mediator role. However, sometimes we are not able to put in mechanisms in place such that we sustain the change that would have happened as a result of the good instructional design or the good L&D practices that have been put in place. And one of the things we discussed was the issue of inclusivity, because when you deal with people, you are dealing with a diverse group of people with diverse learning requirements and learning needs. And so it's important for you to actually do a thorough needs assessment that would allow that inclusivity to come through in terms of how you then would be able to package your learning programs. And yeah, it became important also that you need to have your audience in mind. So as much as you've got the final change in mind in terms of what it is you want the final outcome to be, that needs to also be driven by your level of understanding of the audience. Because if you don't understand your audience and what their requirements are, then it becomes difficult for you for whatever programs you have in place to work, especially if they are not geared and aligned to their needs. We also spoke about the focus on learning really being a journey and change being a journey. So it's not a once-off type of solution where you take, for example, your senior managers, you expose them to a learning program and that's it. You've got to have ways in which to actually then empower them and make sure you sustain the learning as time goes on. Because otherwise, if it's a once-off solution, the minute that they've been exposed to that learning program and everyone walks away from it, then that learning is there for a short period of time, and you don't sustain the learning and the change doesn't happen. And so it becomes like a tick box exercise. And I think another thing that we also mentioned was just looking at the fact that it's important that bearing in mind the different audiences, let's gear our programs aligned to the different audiences. Some senior managers might just need a short-term intervention, but your junior levels will need something practical to actually then help them to sustain that learning. If I've left anything, my group members are available to just make an additional input. But yeah, we had quite interesting discussions on that.
Right, thank you. Anybody from that room wants to add? Mbali, you've unmuted.
Yes, I just wanted to say that Barbara summed it up perfectly. Those are all the key points that we talked about in our insightful conversation. I don't know if anybody needs to add something. Don't think
Good.
so.
But Barbara or Gugu?
Oh, sorry, Google.
It's Google.
Yeah.
Right. If everybody is good in that room, then we'll move to the last room, which had Lawrence, Lynn, Richard, and Rod. What feedback? Let's just see who's still here. Oh, everybody is still here from that room. Who's going to give us some feedback?
Todd, do you want to go or not?
You go. You you go ahead, Lynn.
Sure, I'm trying to process. I didn't take very good notes. Yeah, I think we just had a conversation around what kind of stood out for us in terms of what you shared, Craig, and then just started having conversations around it's not this or that, but it's this and that, and how the combination can actually benefit. Because we also spoke about the fact that if you come in there as an OD consultant and you're kind of talking about what needs to happen and setting that down, but people don't know how to do it, you create a sense of dissonance, and that might leave people with a bigger problem than what it started with, was one of the points we made. I think the other thing we spoke about was also around almost going through a training process and then getting back into the workplace, and almost that ecosystem isn't ready to take on some of what has been learned. So I also referred to a leadership program that we did, and almost the leaders matured to such a point that the system wasn't mature enough for some of the changes or the thinking that they had. And it led to people actually leaving the organization. So almost that the balance between how do we work on the system or the ecosystem that we're dealing with, as well as the people that exist within it. Yeah, I'm pulling a thread on, so please feel free to help me. I think the other thing was also around ensuring that, so sometimes some of the training can be quite technical, and there's the assumption that people know now how to do it. So there's almost this performance expectation. And I think Rod came up with some really great ideas around including the line manager in that process, in terms of them setting the context so that once people go into the training, they actually understand why they're there. But also almost the reintegration back into the workplace to say, okay, so what has been learned? How can we use some of what was learned in the training as well? Rod and Richard, please feel free to add. Those were some of the top things that I can remember.
Yeah, I think Richard brought up the example that linked well with Gugu's group around the ticking the box kind of events, and how, as an example of things that aren't particularly successful quite often, the assumption that because we've sort of like a sheep dip, we put people through a program that's now going to result in some change or something like that. Yeah. I think we spoke a lot about the need to work together, just as different departments and silos and teams need to work together in the organization. So we need to model that as well in these fields, that we work together.
And Rod, if I could put you on the spot a little and ask you, have you experienced any cases of an organizational change or organizational development project where instructional design played a good part? So instructional design inside L&D, or instructional design straight into the change program as part of comms, or but this is fascinating me. I'm looking for these cases of where instructional designers have stepped up right into the, into the frame, the central frame of the work. Is that happening anywhere as far as you know?
Yeah, I do see it. A lot of the work I do does have quite a component of some programmed, deliberately intentional, designed experiential learning, and then building on that. And it's related to, some of it's related to something you said, Craig, around language and around both these things bring language. And there's that old quote from way back that sort of better language makes better science. If we clear, we've got a common language, if we're sharing some mutual understandings, when we use a word like manager or work or whatever, we can disagree with each other, but at least we can disagree intelligently because we're talking the same language. Whereas, look at the average LinkedIn posting or arguments about leadership versus manager or this or that, and you realize they're talking different language. They've all got good points, and so to have some common language within an organization that we can use to talk about our organization is really helpful. And instructional design surely has a really valued part to play in that, as long as we're working together with OD, with the very pragmatic line managers who are trying to get something done. And we're clear what that big purpose is, Yeah, I mentioned in my group, I've got a friend who started to call herself an organizational ecologist, which I really quite like. And I think if the organization is the ecology within which things grow or don't grow or happen or not, the role, OD and L&D have such an important part to play in helping that ecology to be a really good place for human beings and for the purpose.
Craig, can I hand back to you? Everybody's given us their feedback from the rooms. Unless something came up for somebody in what you now heard that you'd like to comment on.
Yes, we've got a minute or two if anybody wants to do anything summative before I attempt that. Let me just leave a little bit of space for the wonderful people on the call. If you had something to say to wrap it up, what would it be?
Can I just come in there, Craig? It's not a wrap-up thought, but one thing that we had also shared just right at the end of our session is it's a cheeky thought to say, how about, do any organizations, from people that are practicing OD, does any organization actually build in the behaviors coming out of what needs to be achieved out of the change intervention? Do those get also built into the performance management system in terms of these are the behaviors we're going to rate you on? These are the kinds of changes that we want to see at the end of year 1, end of year 2, or whatever the issue is. Because that then, which is the pocket of the person, it says, I won't be promoted until I show these behaviors, or my team behaves in this kind of way. So that was just a small thought that we had. Because one of the things that the team members were saying in our group is that you do these things, but you feel like you're forcing people. I think the organization that you come from, Craig, also offers people, an opportunity to be part of some engagement just free of charge. But it's like you have to force people to do that, even if it's free. So we're thinking, okay, what can motivate people to do this? Maybe then is to build into your performance to say, well, you're not going to go to level 2 or level 3 because you're not yet showing these kind of changes in your behavior or in your team's behavior, for example.
Barbara, thank you.
That's great.
Carry on, Rod. Carry on.
Sorry, no, I just add to that. It's not a but, it's an and, that from the OD side, we need to make sure so that the systems in the organization not only allow but encourage that behavior that Barbara's talking about. because it's unfair, isn't it, in a way, to say here's some behaviors we want you to practice, and then back in the workplace there are systems which are actually driving them to behave quite differently, you know, even some reward systems which encourage a lack of cooperation between departments, but we've told them we want to see more collaboration, but then we measure them or we set them up so that they are likely, probably, you know, we can predict they might not want to collaborate. So it's how we come together. Yeah, it's so important.
Lots of nodding on that. Nice trigger there, Barbara. Gugu, anybody else want to add or build on that? We've got a minute or two, and then I'm going to start wrapping up. Well, I think Barbara beautifully connected us back to the bigger sweep of the work. Issue-centric OD, firstly. What is the issue? And I lose sleep, or I dream about how many issues organizations are trying to address simultaneously. And then what does the question even mean when you say, what is the issue? There are issues being addressed by L&D, there are issues being addressed by OD, there are issues being addressed by HR, there are issues being addressed by line, and the issues collide, and the interventions then all collide. And it's a noisy place, and it creates an immense amount of busyness. Good design tries to cut through that. So the centrality of a clear strategy. We heard from Rochelle in our breakaway just how their firm of 60,000 people is being united by their clear strategy, being united by a few rallying calls, a few central ideas. And that's where the good stories were coming from. And when we say united, Barbara reminds us that it's strategy, it's structure, and when we say structure, we mean processes and systems and all sorts of things. It's leadership, and those things coming together into what we call culture and norms and the way we do things. And as Rod pointed out, a lot of the times, those things are all acting not in concert, they're acting against each other. And maybe, when L&D and OD work together, if they're well resourced, they might be able to cut through some of that noise and start to align some of that effort. To everybody who showed up and stayed as long as they could and joined us to the end, thanks very much for 90 minutes of your time. Rod, big particular thanks for joining us from Oz. I know this is still a sense of home for you on this end of the world, but it's a great treat for us to have someone of your stature in the OD field join us. And the same to every single one of you, every contributor, every person who spoke in a breakout. Thanks for being part of the work. Thanks for being part of the community, and thanks for joining us today.